This is a piece of Ethiopian Orthodox Christian manuscript called a Harag, depicting the patron Saint George. Later interpretations of this icon portray him slaying a dragon, but this is an earlier work. African art in this style would later pique the interest of a man by the name of Pablo Picasso in developing the early proto or analytical stages of the Cubism movement. You can see the resemblance, especially in the forms that show the face. And if we zoom out a little bit, we'll see that this is actually the cover of Graceland by Paul Simon, released in 1986. Next, we're jumping to the seminal work from Florentine early Renaissance painter Sandro Botticelli. We're breaking some controversial territory here, as we have the idealization of a full-length nude of a secular or pagan goddess emerging on the scallop shell blown by the wind of Zephyr, and yet there's something about the framing and depth of this painting that feels a bit off in terms of perspective. And of course, Lady Gaga uses pieces of this painting inlaid into her album cover for Art Pop, released in 2013, and this is only the first historical reference we'll be seeing of this album cover. Vitruvian Man by the Blue Ninja Turtle. You've seen this before, if not in its original form like what we have here, then definitely recreated by some pop culture space, but the original has this sort of empirical sterility in its barrenness, purposeful in highlighting the seemingly perfect proportions of the human body. You can see how his extremities inscribe both a perfect circle and square. And so naturally I have here Lola versus the Powerman and the Money Go Around Part 1. This is best seen through the illustration on the back cover, and yeah, just an iconic piece. It's also the cover to Wanna by Gun. Next, we're going to take yet another look at the Blue Ninja Turtles work. This is The Last Supper, completed at the end of the 15th century. One of the most famous / greatest pieces ever created because of how dynamic this thing is. It's riddled with symbolism, the triangulation of Christ in the center, the barrier of the divine in the table, Judas's encroachment into the same dish Jesus is reaching towards, Peter's knife foreshadowing the violence to follow, perfect compositional symmetry and linear perspective, iconic legendary piece. It's also used on this heavy metal album from the 80s, the band called Blaspheme. Hieronymus Bosch, Garden of Earthly Delights. We're now into the 16th century, and this is by far one of the wildest, craziest pieces of art in this whole video. This is a triptych that is jam-packed with wild, pre-surrealist, pre-absurdist symbols, characters, episodes really. Think about those elementary school trifold boards you would get at Michael's for the school science fair, except this one is made from oil paint wood and not crammed the night before, thereby waking up your parents at 4 a.m. to buy markers and construction paper because it's due the next day. So we have the inclusion of the third panel depicting Hell on Deep Purple's self-titled album. This is a zoomed in portion of the panel where we have this avian bird-like creature devouring this person and defecating them into this well, and he's not even the only creature defecating into this void. And to me, this piece is a warning against the sin of indulgence, gluttony, hedonism, starting with the leftmost panel, the sin of lust as Adam and Eve are banished and its cruel, brutal consequences. And we have another frame of the panel of hell shown on the cover of Celtic Frost's Into the Pandemonium, this time showing the scene of burning buildings and incendiary chaos. Now we've got the red Ninja Turtle here with Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was a martyr for her faith that died to the breaking wheel, shown as the item she's leaning on here. This is a death that was commanded by Emperor Maxentius in the 4th century. The ever so slight twist in her body's form is likely a reference to a work by Blue Ninja Turtle, Leda and the Swan. This detail is important because we're going to take just the torso of this painting and collage it onto an iconic 90s rock record, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness by Smashing Pumpkins, and we'll come back to the face in a couple hundred years. Red Ninja Turtle here with another classic work of the High Renaissance. This is a wall fresco. The School of Athens highlights the prestige and honor of great thinkers, education, teaching, philosophy, and science. You have the two main figures in the center of the piece, Plato and Aristotle. Plato pointing to the sky, hinting at his fascination and preference to side on the air of the divine, ethereal, and unseen order. Aristotle, Plato's student, representing the school of thought pertaining to the physical, the tangible, the observable. And on the right side, we have the two figures of importance for this video, one attentively jotting down the final notes of the material the professor just wrote on the board before class was dismissed, while the other figure mooches off of him because he's too lazy to write down himself and make his own Quizlet for the upcoming test. But anyway, these two figures make up the albums Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 by Guns N' Roses. This is Netherlandish proverbs, or the Dutch proverbs, proverbial sayings and phrases such as living Robux to Robux, spending money on DLC, banging your head against a wall because you have a bunch of inters on your team, a hoe without a handle, which in the literal sense refers to someone who isn't on social media, and my personal favorite, don't cry over spilled goop. Robin Pecknold himself has gone on record by saying that this painting spoke to him because at a distance it looks like an unsuspecting, beautiful landscape, but when you get up close you see the crazy mess of affairs at play, and that's supposed to be symbolic of the content on the record as well, contrasting beautiful indie folk instrumentation with profound lyricism. I'm going to count this artwork for our mannerism movement checkbox because, I mean, let's be honest, this is just ugly. The Allegory of Water by Giuseppe Arcimboldo, probably pronounced that incorrectly, using up all these goobab, doodad sea creatures to comprise the form of this man's portrait, kind of of reminds me of those optical illusions where your brain has to switch between two inputs. You know, what do you see first? Former President Richard Nixon or your ex-wife? But this man just embodies the element of water in a multi-part series of works. And no, I'm not referring to The Mollusk by Ween. This is the 1975 album Mask by Kansas. Here we have a hand-colored engraving of Martin Heemskerk's Pharaohs of Alexandria, or Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So sure, we'll count this one as a manners piece as well, why not? It fits the chronological bill. And for this piece, I have Macedon's Leviathan. In order to see the actual reproduction of the lighthouse tower, you have to look at the packaging insert with the full cover art that includes this detail at the top. And we'll be back in a few centuries to this very album art to talk about this big, one might say great wave right here. The Entombment of Christ by Caravaggio. This is an intensely stark painting, the dramatic tenebrism and gravity of the moment displayed through this heavy contrast and use of shadow. Compositionally, we're led to believe we are so incredibly close to the figures in this work. You can see every wound, vein, expression, and emotion. And I'll take this opportunity to lump in David with the head of Goliath as well, a painting dated just a few years after by Caravaggio. Notably, the late Virgil Abloh is credited for designing, or I guess in this case, curating the album artwork for both Pray for Paris, released in 2020, and Then You Pray For Me, released in 2023. This is a Baroque marble sculpture that models after a tale in Greek mythology between the characters Apollo and Daphne. Apollo is, among many things, the god of music and poetry, so naturally we'll call him Playboy Cardi for the sake of simplicity, who has fallen in love with Daphne, the daughter of a river god, who tries to escape Cardi's advances and ends up turning into a laurel tree. Excuse me, a Yanny tree. And so that's what we see here in the sculpture. This is a frame of action and motion. Everything from Cardi's embrace around Daphne to the coiling drapery feels like we have literally captured a frame in time. And this is the second appearance that we'll see for the cover of Art Pop by Lady Gaga once again. Not that much information is known about this piece, but this is Two African Men by Rembrandt. Contextually, Rembrandt was living in a time in a community where free black men also resided in during this Dutch golden age in Amsterdam. And so the two figures in this painting are believed to be either neighbors or possibly brothers. So this is a bit of a radical painting for the time, as African people were almost always portrayed in art as enslaved people. Here, Rembrandt preserves their individuality in this intimate exchange where one of the figures seeks comfort and seems to be a bit more contemplative and downtrodden, while the other seems to be a bit more optimistic in his facial expression. The painting, of course, being the cover art to the legendary Wurtz project Ethiops, released in 2022. Jean-Baptiste Croise, The Souvenir. Pretty much the only piece of information I can find about this work is that the dog she's holding is a symbol of fidelity. Other than that, I'm going to count this as our one Rococo painting in this video. And yes, I know that by the late 18th century, this style is sort of being phased out and replaced with neoclassicism. And this painting is not as traditionally flowery and ornate as a Fragonard painting, for example. I'd say it's pretty close. And with the face of this woman together with Raphael's St. Catherine's torso, we can superimpose and complete melancholy and the infinite sadness. If you're familiar with Rate Your Music, you've definitely at least seen this image before. This is Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Marat. Jean-Paul Marat was a political journalist who was responsible for publishing ideals during the French Revolution that championed a new republic and a turn of the tide from the aristocracy and corrupt monarchy. A central figure in this Jacobin party, which is why David seems to be sympathizing with his position as a martyr, echoing his body language to symbolize his moral beliefs, likening to that of a Pietà of Christ himself. Apparently David was in cahoots with the big dog himself, Maximilien Robespierre. But anyway, Marat had a debilitating skin disease that would require him to soak in medical baths for several hours a day. And you can see the wounds where Charlotte Corday, a supporter of the Jourdan group, assassinated him. I'm obviously not an expert at all on all the nuances of the political factions of the French Revolution. I just personally think this is one of the hardest album covers in this video to one of the hardest post-punk albums ever. And of course, I'm talking about Death Consciousness by Have a Nice Life. Francisco Goya has always been one of those artists to me that truly and indiscriminately does not hold back any ambitions whatsoever in his art. Here we have Witch's Sabbath, created at the tail end of the 18th century. And this piece is almost satirical in nature and just how over the top and overt the symbolism is. Firstly, the embodiment of Satan himself in the middle of the composition, surrounded by a gathering of, well, witches of various ages. And of course, the most striking detail of this painting being the inclusion of these babies and fetuses. These are starved, neglected infants. This one appears to be suffocated. These are hanging out to dry by their necks. And this one who's about to undergo a similar fate. This piece is the cover to the 2002 doom metal album Into the Rectory of the Bizarre Reverends by Reverend Bizarre. The Raft of the Medusa by Jericho depicts a gruesome scene. A French ship known as the Medusa Medusa ran out of space on the limited lifeboats it had with politicians and noblemen, and so a last-minute raft was produced to hold soldiers and common folk. A line connecting the raft to the boat was severed, thus abandoning many out in the ocean. Notice the decay of rotting corpses, loss, a last food supply of bodies, and a few forming a pyramid, signaling a ship in the distance as a last-minute SOS attempt. A landmark romanticism painting that was used by the Pogues in 1985, Rum, Sodomy, and the Lash. Probably the most disturbing image in this entire video, Saturn devouring his son, or at least one of his children, as Saturn is the god of time, and by devouring each of his children, he can prevent their rule from dethroning his own glory. Very graphic, grotesque portrayal of this event. The forms are almost melting, and let me just remind you that this painting comes from a series known as Goya's Black Paintings, a reflection of his mental state and his reaction to the political institutions established around him. A painting that was plastered onto the walls of his own house. Yes, this was shown on the walls of his very own home, and this grim imagery creates the album cover for Lunar Womb by The Obsessed, released in 1991. Liberty Leading the People. This is a political painting once again representing an overthrow of power from King Charles X to King Louis Philippe, where we have this purely symbolic character, this personified embodiment of liberty, freedom, idealized in the forms of Roman antiquity. This is of course the cover to Coldplay's 2008 release, Viva la Vida, or Death and All His Friends. Under the Wave of Kanagawa, also known as the Great Wave, this is a polychrome woodblock print using ink on paper. Think of multiple hand-carved stamps used to create one image, one massive stamp for each color that you see. This particular work is part of a larger series called 36 Views of Mount Fuji. However, here the cresting of the wave of such great magnitude that it overshadows even Mount Fuji itself, which is centered compositionally as well as some boats lost in the mist. It's believed that Katsushika Hokusai had sort of a fixated interest on Mount Fuji, kind of like another artist I know who had a fascination with a mountain near them. And if you go back to the extended version of Leviathan by Macedon's cover art, you can see the inclusion of the wave on the right hand side. This is another woodblock print from the same era as the Great Wave. This is Evening Snow at Kanbara. You probably recognize this work immediately if, number one, you are a fanatic for 19th century Japanese woodblock prints, or perhaps the more likely option like me, number two, if you've never talked to a woman before, and that's because this is the cover of Pinkerton by Weezer. This piece is taken from once again a series of 4 paintings created by Thomas Cole called The Voyage of Life. The one presented here represents old age, a wintry, desolate landscape of Earth, contrasted with the heavenly angels welcoming him into a transition into the sky. After experiencing the rapids, dangers, twists and turns of life, of the hourglass that was once affixed to the bow of the boat has been lost at sea, and so the end of the man's life is here. And in 1987, Swedish doom metal band Candlemass used this piece for the cover of Nightfall. Here we have John Everett Millay, a member of the pre-Raphaelite movement, showing the moment when Ophelia decides to unalive herself in GTA, or simply drown herself after Hamlet kills her father. Notice the immense level of detail and care taken to show every reed, twig, flora, fauna, painstaking detail that Millay observed himself outside in a reference setting for several hours a day. And I'm sure the same level of care and attention went into Taylor Swift's version of this painting for this absolutely horrendous Great Day of His Wrath, or in this case, the third image in a triptych of paintings by John Martin. This one in particular is The Last Judgment. Initially intended to be a great theater experience, viewing these works in the cinema with thunderous, booming sound effects, flashes of lightning, ominous reading. The work itself, a blend of influences, the first obviously being the end times depicted in the Book of Revelation, the second being Martin's contemporary setting of the so-called Black Country of London, where sickening hygiene malpractice mixed with large-scale industrialization produced a similarly gloomy landscape. The British heavy metal band Angel Witch would later go on to use this work for their album As Above, So Below in 2012. The Death of Abel, a pretty self-explanatory work, an engraving by French artist and illustrator Gustave Doré. I could have picked numerous works from him. In fact, I'll put a link in the description to a wonderfully compiled video that goes into exclusively metal albums that take their cover art from classic paintings, and Gustave Doré shows up in multiple entries. But I wanted to include this biblical piece that comes from the famous story of Cain slaying Abel out of jealousy, labeling him as the first murderer in history. This engraving, of course, was used for the cover of Ka's 2020 release, Descendants of Cain. Moulin de la Galette. Renoir depicts a scene, a fleeting moment in time that feels like a snapshot captured as what could have been a photograph, but instead is an impressionist painting. A beer hall in Paris with the hustle and bustle of many figures just enjoying the day, mundane little pleasures and leisures of downtime. The sunlight just barely patterns and pokes through the leaves of the trees above and scatters onto the scene. Now, Rod Stewart modified this painting for his 1976 album A Night on the Town, and I'm not sure if it's the digital reconstruction, but this is an immensely disappointing reference to Renoir. I mean, the whole point of the original painting is to use color, rosy, pinkish pigments, and pale hues to create a playful scene filled with light, but Rod Stewart decides to do the absolute opposite and just muddies everything up. It's almost as if he put a deep-fried meme filter over the whole painting and slapped on the most hideous font he could find onto the cover and just called it a day. Here we have something a bit different, a set of albumin print photographs taken by Edward Moy Bridge, capturing different frames of the movement of a running horse that proved once and for all that there are moments in a horse's gait where the horse is flying, so to speak, or where all four limbs leave the ground. There is a gaining trust in photography as an art form and really as a tool to illuminate more about what our human eye cannot always see or measure, and this was an immensely inspiring work when developing the cover for Sprain's The Lamb as Effigy, released in 2023. This bronze sculpture by Rodin takes two figures, Paolo and Francesca, two lovers eternally residing in Canto number 5 of Dante's Inferno. Notice the spiral compositional twisting in the forms of the entwined figures. We can see a replication of the sculpture in Marvin Gaye's 1978 record, Here My Dear. The story from Greek mythology goes that Orpheus was taught by Apollo to play the lyre, and in his beautiful song attracted Eurydice, who became his wife. Eurydice was bitten by a snake, died instantly, and Orpheus went on a journey into the underworld, confronting Hades to bring her back to life. He could do so only under the condition that Eurydice had to walk behind him, and he was not allowed to look back at her. He agreed, and right as he was about to escape with her, doubt crept into his mind. He looked back, and Eurydice was sent back to Hades forever. This marble sculpture by Rodin depicts a moment in their trek back to the overworld, and Arcade Fire would use this for their 2013 release, Reflector. This is Van Gogh's self-portrait with bandaged ear, an impasto oil painting which alludes to the famous tale of Van Gogh cutting off his ear after what was likely a fit of mental unraveling or a fallout with fellow painter and close collaborator Paul Gauguin, and then gifting the ear portion to a woman named either Gabby or Rachel at a local brothel. This would eventually put Van Gogh into an insane asylum. We can actually see the influence that Japanese art at the time had profoundly on Van Gogh's work, not just in the style but in the reference of the background. There's a portrait in the studio that hangs a woodblock print, much like what we saw in the Ukiyo-e section, and Joni Mitchell in 1994 would insert herself into the style of Van Gogh to create the cover for Turbulent Indigo. Here we have a still life called Basket of Roses by Henri Fontaine-Latour, an amazing array of colors that stick to one palette of cream whites, apricot, and maroon hues, all popping out at you, contrasted against this monochrome dark beige background. When Peter Saville took this piece and designed the cover for Power, Corruption, and Lies for New Order in 1983, he added these blocks of opaque color that can actually be decoded into a message, that message being Fact 75 when you look at the color key on the back of the outer sleeve of the record's pressing. This is a photograph of Lot Long, a thatcher carrying a bundle of sticks who lived in the region of Wiltshire County, England. Legend goes that singer Robert Plant stumbled upon this image at a local antique or secondhand store and used it for the cover of their legendary 1971 release Led Zeppelin 4, which is technically untitled. An enigmatic cover laid upon this flaking, peeling wallpaper really symbolizes rural living, and to me this is sort of a sister album in contrast to the cover of Physical Graffiti. John Collier's Lady Godiva depicts the moment in which this woman is protesting in a way against her own husband, Earl Leofric, who said to her he'll lower taxes onto the people if she rides naked on a horse throughout the town. Now what he didn't expect was for her to actually do it. The painting's colors and composition uses her as a symbol of resilience, courage, chastity, and purity, and in line with the pre-Raphaelite style we have intense attention to detail, especially in the city's infrastructure in the background. This symbol would be taken as inspiration to create Beyonce's 2022 album Renaissance, and you could also argue this is a source of inspiration for Beyonce in 2024 when she released the cover for Cowboy Carter. Looking now at works by Henri Rousseau, we have the repast of the lion as well as the snake charmer sitting at an awkward stylistic crossroads that escapes classicism and is now turning to embrace modernism. Rousseau was the laughingstock for his style, which critics at the time labeled as naivete or primitivism, and due to his lack of classical training but also a result of ethnocentric attitudes surrounding his subject matter, he was sort of a trailblazer for the surrealists and created these dreamlike landscapes that artist Brett Livingstone Strong would use to model for the cover of Fleetwood Mac's 1987 release Tango in the Night. Egon Schiella's self-portraits, shifting the main focus of art from antiquity or revered stories to himself. It's all about himself, depicting himself in these uncomfortable, visceral ways. As an honest expressionist painter, often posing in these impossibly twisted forms, we see the inspiration being used on David Bowie's 1979 album Lodger. And while we're on the topic of Bowie, you might as well bring up Erich Heckel's Roquai Roll, a stark depiction of yet another German expressionist by the name of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Could not find much information on this unsettling woodcut piece, but it likely portrays his descent into substance abuse and mental spiraling, essentially. But Bowie would be inspired by the posing for the cover of 1977's Heroes, as well as Iggy Pop's The Idiot, released earlier that same year. Okay, so we're entering a new territory of modernism from Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg that seems to be abstracting and reducing forms to a maximal extreme, even beyond what we saw in Cubism. I like to think of wherever Squidward was trapped in that empty purgatory abyss in episode SB129. These compositions are paintings that use primary colors, rectilinear geometry. We see the sense of perfect order, balance, harmony in neoplastic works by Mondrian, what is believed to be a reactionary mediation after the chaos and destruction of World War I, symbolizing the hope to rebuild and create a more orderly utopia. Ethiopia. And the White Stripes would go on to use this style for their aptly named 2000 album De Stijl. Back to something a bit more tangible, we have here a bronze cast sculpture by James Earl Fraser called The End of the Trail. This is showing a Sioux Native American with a spear in hand, absolutely exhausted, tired, defeated, both the person and the horse sharing the same body language, symbolizing the forceful confinement and exile of Native Americans as a result of the Indian Removal Act in the 19th century. This sculpture forces us to confront and remind us of this shameful, disgusting period of American history. Interestingly enough, the Beach Boys would use this symbol to create their 1971 album Surf's Up, arguably their bleakest cover the Beach Boys have ever chosen for their entire discography, perhaps in the face of critics who wouldn't take their music very seriously. Here we have an oil painting by Fred Dana Marsh depicting a moment where the USS President Lincoln, a ship that had been making successful routes across the Atlantic between New York and France to deliver both supporting men and supplies to the German front during World War I. However, one of the journeys resulted in a German torpedo attack that caused the sinking of the ship, leading to an array of scattered lifeboats. But if we zoom in on the bottom right hand corner and then mirror the painting, we get the cover of The Avalanche's Since I Left You, released in 2000. Three musicians, Pablo Picasso, but here we have a landmark painting of the synthetic cubism movement. There are actually two versions of this painting with noticeable differences in color, texture, and even composition, but essentially we're moving away from the highly detailed deconstructist approach of early analytical cubism to a cut paper, collage, illusion style with simpler forms in this synthetic cubist work that went on to inspire Barney Bubbles to make a pastiche or homage to this work when constructing the cover for Elvis Costello and the Attractions' Imperial Bedroom, released in 1982. Moving past the phenomenon of cubism, El Lissitzky was a key foundational player in the movements of constructivism and suprematism. Lithographic prints such as Beat the Whites with the Red Edge used extremely reduced forms to create a political statement. In order for art to have utilitarian value or purpose by way of propaganda, here representing the Russian Civil War, the conflict between red communists and white monarchists. This moves us into a realm of suprematist ideals, instituted thanks to Lissitzky's tutelage under Kazimir Malevich, who laid the groundwork for achieving even more barren, more abstracted forms to transcend and dare reach a higher plane of supreme spiritual ideals in art. German electronic band Kraftwerk was inspired by Lissitzky to create their 1978 album artwork, The Man Machine. So where do we go from here now that we've completely abstracted and dissolved all forms? Well, the surrealists like Joan Miro would take over. Contemporary to this new wave of psychoanalytical psychology, we have an art movement that is emulating these ideals through painting, letting the unconscious mind of the automatic take over the artist's intentions or vessel. This particular piece is called Calculation 1925, and it was used as a direct source of musical inspiration for the Dave Brubeck Quartet on Time Further Out in 1961. John Hartfield, Five Fingers Has the Hand, a powerful force in German political art with roots in the Dada movement and closely developing the photomontage style. This is an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi political poster encouraging the five political candidates to take down and oppose Hitler's regime, the enemy upon which the five-fingered hand will grab. And this would become the cover to System of a Down's self-titled album released in 1998. Edward Hopper Nighthawks depicts this almost uncanny scene of this diner or bar late at night where so much of the street and the setting is barren and stripped away. There's just a few characters here, yet our collective consciousness recognizes this very American, familiar place, bringing the sentiment of realism that was once from common folk working menial blue-collar jobs to the modernism of the contemporary American lifestyle. We see Chris Rie use this template for his 2004 album, The Blue Jukebox. Here we have a lithograph print by none other than M.C. Escher, an artist influenced by mathematics. And we can see that here in this hexagonal tessellation that exists in the center of the page of these lizards or reptiles, as well as the dodecahedron platonic solid that exists as sort of a paperweight here. In this imaginative, cyclical fashion, they seem to leave the two-dimensional realm into our plane of existence and then circle back into the page. And if we color this print, we get Mott the Hoople's self-titled release from 1969, Mott the Hoople. Icarus by Henri Matisse. Matisse was a bit of a chameleon that sort of spanned multiple periods and movements of definition, from Fauvism, post-impressionism to even modernism, and this work is a collage of cut pieces of paper that comes from a larger booklet of scenes and stories called Jazz, interpreted as either performing trapeze artists under a circus tent or perhaps symbolizing the fall of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. In 1980, Steve Winwood would use this piece to inspire the cover art for Arc of a Diver. This is a photograph taken by American photographer Tony Purcell called Weeki Wachee Spring, Florida, 1947, which is this Floridian attraction and water park, this one taken in the Mermaid Theater section of the park. Purcell was typically known for capturing photography regarding fashion, capturing moments of World War II, but here we have a striking image. What's amazing to me is how there are zero bubbles, zero turbulence in the water, almost like she's floating in space. Of course, this is also the cover to Undercurrent by Bill Evans from 1962. We're now breaking ground into the 1950s, and I just want to mention this Japanese-American artist S. Neil Fujita, who designed legendary covers such as Roundabout Midnight by Miles Davis in 1957, Time Out by the Dave Brubeck Quartet in 1959, Mingus Sa'um, Charles Mingus August 1959, and Walnut Music Exactly, also the Godfather logo in 1969 as well. Here we have a British pop artist harkening back to the symbols and themes of the American Civil War on war/game. A blend of collage style but also oil painterly style depicting Civil War imagery of this clash between the Union and the Confederates. Zoomed in, this is of course the sophomore album Room on Fire, released in 2003 by The Strokes. Roy Lichtenstein in the car. A bit of a radical painting even in the modern art era, because now we're exiting convention completely. Everything about it is silly, fun, playful, almost ridiculous, comic book like. It challenges the limits of what can be considered art that hangs up in an exhibition or a museum, even if the subject matter comes from leisure, pop culture, or entertainment. And I'm cheating a little bit here because this is a single, not a full album, released by Bobby Orlando, or just Bobby O, in 1983 called I Cry For You. But I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk about Roy Lichtenstein. Bridget Riley is an English painter existing in the op art canon, or optical art style. And yes, these are optical illusion paintings that rely on bending the compositional space, manipulating line and color to create these just disorienting pieces. This particular one with the canvas rotated is called Crest, and the German experimental krautrock band Faust would use this for their 1973 release, The Faust Tapes. Back to the surrealists, here we have The Son of Man by Rene Magritte, a self-portrait that evokes biblical imagery and themes from the title to the illusion to the forbidden fruit. This identityless man representing something so mundane and really simple and yet out of our reach and hidden like the supernatural or our connection to the divine. If you look at the 1978 album by Rush, Hemispheres, we see a reference to a man wearing the same bowler hat and suit with a similar pose. We're moving into architecture now, and don't forget, it's still art. Here we have the Marina City, designed by Bertrand Goldberg, that sits on the Chicago River. We have 2 towers, 65 floors, used for both residential and commercial purposes, and it looks like corn on the cob. And if you're an indie head, you already know what this is. This is the cover to Wilco's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, released in 2002. And I guess while we're on the topic of architecture, let's mention Habitat 67, a residential complex designed by Moshe Safdie. This building is in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and on this brutalist style with these almost dangerous looking rectilinear rooms that seem to cantilever over the edge. It feels like a game of Jenga that's about to topple at any moment, and while it's not entirely apparent at the surface, this complex actually makes an appearance on Velocity Design Comfort by Sweet Trip, released in 2003. And lastly, it wouldn't be a complete art analysis video without at least some mention of one of the most iconic artists really of all time. This would be of course the legendary Andy Warhol, head of creative operations at The Factory, basically a creative makerspace for visual art, filmmaking, and music. We have the iconic album art of the bandana cover for the Velvet Underground and Nico. He designed Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones, as well as this film called Flesh, where a still of the main character played by Joe D'Alessandro became the cover for the Smiths' self-titled record. Warhol's own silkscreen self-portrait prints have even taken a life of their own, inspiring countless artists to follow suit. U2's album Pop, Blur's greatest hits album, Queen's Hot Space, just to name a few notable examples. I mean, the DNA of his ethos and his style permeates into so many covers and genres, transcending the symbol of the artist itself and revolutionizing a subversive, bold aesthetic that will leave an unforgettable legacy to pop culture as a whole. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know if I should make a video covering contemporary art. I know I stopped at the modern art era, but there are some great covers from the 1970s onward that produced some of the most recognizable album covers of the century. And let me know, what is the best album cover that pulls from famous art, and what album cover did I miss? But that's it for me, and I'll see you in the next one.